Hi, Josh.
Hey, Bob. How you doing?
Better now that we got our tech problems straightened out. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, and I've just endured some tech problems along with you. But we're recording, and you're Josh Summers. You are a meditation teacher, yoga teacher, other things. What else are you? What do you like to highlight about yourself?
For the purposes of this conversation, I am an anxious citizen looking for guidance.
Okay. We'll see what we can do. So by way of background, I guess you and I have had a series of conversations, which always feel a little self-indulgent to me because they're about my worldview, which you have flatteringly dubbed the Dharma of Bob. And we're going to continue these conversations, partly out of my desire to get your guidance on how to do a better job of conveying my worldview to people. But, first, I wanted to mention Michael Brooks, the late Michael Brooks, who passed away a little over a year ago, I guess, right? Because his death is what led to this series of conversations. He was, you knew him better than I did, but we both knew him. And he was, a prominent podcaster, journalist of, it is safe to say, a leftist perspective, but also a follower of the Dharma, a meditator, and with
a comedic twist.
With a comedic twist. He was a very funny guy. He passed away suddenly without warning, and he, as it happened, I had been scheduled to go on his show a week or so after that tragedy and talk about cognitive empathy, which is an important part of my worldview and refers to this business of just trying to understand another person's perspective, not to be confused with emotional empathy, which is more like feeling their pain. But anyway, I want to let you say anything you want to say about Michael. I think, it's a good time to say it. I don't know. You recently went to, I think, a commemorative service, that was close to the 1 year after.
It was it was maybe, I think, a month or so after the date of his death, which I think was July 20th, thereabouts. The commemorative memorial, that just happened last August was sort of the slated to be the anniversary / memorial for him that couldn't really happen during the depth of the pandemic. But tragically and kind of weirdly, his father died just days before that memorial this year.
Oh.
So what the family ended up doing was having a dual memorial, which was interesting. And so it was quite an intense experience.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was, one of the body workers that his father had been seeing, spoke to the father's anxiety about the upcoming memorial and wanting to be able to speak and commemorate his son well. And it seemed like this affected something in him that led to his demise. But yeah, no, it was celebratory because they were both hearing more about Michael's dad allowed me to even understand Michael more. And I don't think I would have had that view had the dual memorial not occurred.
Huh.
His dad was also very comedic, very, tremendous passion and interest in self-authentication and individuation and really helping people achieve the most in their life. And I think that was a big strain of Michael too.
What had his father's career been?
That's a good question. I think he kind of cobbled and struggled a bit with his career, but he was a radio host in the Northampton area of Massachusetts. Yeah. He had interviewed all sorts of folks, including people like Deepak Chopra and various folks. And he really seemed to be, my sense was it was sort of a life coach / radio host. And that's what everyone spoke about, that his friends that got up to speak always talked about how he encouraged them to pursue their best, even whilst his own life was kind of crumbling. And that was something that Michael, I knew, knowing him personally, he struggled with, the kind of lack of stability that he had early in life. And there was a fair amount of poverty.
Right.
That Michael experienced, and food scarcity, and, looking at the direction that Michael was moving in terms of his politics, I think that experience of scarcity and poverty really shaped the vision of what he wanted to bring into the world.
Yeah. And what Michael had done was so impressive. I mean, he was very entrepreneurial. He had started the Michael Brooks Show. After kind of co-hosting the Sam Seder thing, I guess, for a long time, right?
Right.
And the show was a huge success and had a big following. And that's hard to do.
Yeah. No, and I think it was I did a podcast episode on Michael for my own podcast at one point, and I was trying to weave together the three big sides of Michael that I think gave him his unique ability to connect his message. And that was, he had a huge broad view of history and politics, but it was infused with both his own spiritual practice and motivated by the kind of the Buddhist attempt to mitigate suffering as much as possible. But he brought a real wacky sense of humor to the table. And he was creating these mashups, people like the right wing Nelson Mandela, for example, these mashups of characters that I think it shook up people's consciousness in a way about and it got them to see things differently. And I've met and people have emailed me through the book that we co-wrote, but people have said
what's the name of the book?
It's called The Buddhist Playbook.
Buddhist Playbook.
The Buddhist Playbook, right? And which was an attempt to kind of use some of the theory from behavioral economics around decision making to help people develop a more consistent meditation practice. And then which in turn could help their decision making process, beyond the cushion. Anyway, those three things, the Dharma, his sense, his macro view of the world, and, cause he had a much better sense of world history than most people I know. And not world history, but just international relations too. It was very, very deep and trenchant. And he could combine it in this very entertaining way with this witty comedic side that I think was both entertaining and educational. Yeah.
He also took ideas very seriously. He was well grounded in, Marxist theory and various things. And he was young, by my standards, certainly. Roughly how old was he?
30. I want to say 37.
Jeez.
You had, or 36 actually, because he would be 30. I tripped up on the calculation here, but 36, 37.
You had met him in the context of meditation, is that right? At a retreat or not?
Right. Yep. Like you at the Insight Meditation Center.
So you met me at the Insight Meditation Society at a retreat, and you met him there.
Yep. You're my two big Insight Meditation Society friends. But I met him a few years before you, and he was 18 at the time. And he hadn't gone to college yet. And I really knew him more closely before he became the phenom of Michael Brooks. When he got into the majority part, he had moved to New York, and our working relationship had dissolved at that point. We were just we were good friends, but we weren't as close through that, the rise of his public career.
Where did he go to college?
Not far from where I live. He went to Bates College in Lewiston, Maine.
Okay. And you're living in Maine now?
I live about 20 minutes south of Lewiston, yeah.
Okay.
But I will say, on that theme of the Insight Meditation Society, one of the things that I and several of Michael's friends did was we raised some money to support the purchase of a commemorative bench for Michael that is now situated at the Insight Meditation Society. So it's actually very prominently featured, which I feel really good about. And I know Michael would love to know this, but, if you come out the back door of the meditation Dharma hall and turn right as though you're going to sort of loop around towards the dining room.
Yep.
But you're outside in that space. There's a little courtyardy type area. And that's, yep. You'll see the bench next time you're there. So
the bench is there.
It's there.
Okay. Facing, I know this is of interest to a very limited number of listeners, but I have to get this clear for some reason. It's facing, is it facing what used to be called the annex, or is that what it was called? Yeah.
The slab of granite that they used is sort of it's shaped a bit like a little boat, like a little rowboat, and the bow of the boat points more or less to the Dharma hall, and the back of the boat would be facing the annex, or I think now has a more.
So you are facing what when you're sitting? I know we've lost all listeners at this point, but you are facing what when you're sitting in the...
You're facing the institution of IMS. You see the Dharma hall's on your right, the dining hall's front and center, and then the dormitories are on your left.
Okay.
But nice. I think he did inspire many people to come to practice, and I think I'm sure there will be Michael Brooks fans that go and enjoy that bench.
That's nice. Okay. Well, so anyway, people should Google him. He's he lives on.
He does.
And things he wrote, and many things that he videos that he posted. And it's funny, I don't want to talk about this right now, but speaking of IMS, one thing you and I talked about some time ago is some challenges I had sustaining a meditation practice when amid the pandemic, when I couldn't go back to IMS for a kind of a recharge retreat every year or two, as I had been accustomed to doing. And maybe if we have time, we can talk about that later on this in this conversation. But where should we start? Your view.
Well, one segue from Michael Brooks to your worldview is that I think Michael agreed with you that certain features of your worldview, namely that cognitive bias in the human mind distorts perception of events, and the distortion of perception leads to suboptimal forms of engagement, and then even possibly even more suboptimal forms of outcome.
Well, you could call that a central premise of Buddhism as well.
Yep.
Right. That unless we take measures to deal with the problem, our view of the world is distorted, and in ways that hurt us and hurt the people we interact with, and lead to suffering for both.
Right. So I think one of the things I'd like to chat about is, our series of conversations, I've tried to get you to outline some of the key features of this worldview / Dharma of Bob. And over the course of doing that and reading through the comments of some of your followers on your Substack newsletter, which is the Nonzero newsletter, which
thank you.
I read religiously. Apparently Ezra Klein reads it religiously, and hopefully more people are starting to find their way to it. But one of the comments that I remember seeing was someone mentioning that to get the understanding of this lens of analysis and prescription at a more mainstream level, it might behoove you, the articulator, to figure out less jargony terms to use in a way of putting together the picture. Now, I'm not against jargon. I like jargon myself, but that's something a question that I hold up now with you is, we having looked at the basic features of it, how does this how does the sensibility that you're encouraging infiltrate the population?
Yeah. Okay. And by the way, I don't know if Ezra Klein is a religious reader of my newsletter, but he read it enough to have me on his podcast recently, and I'm grateful for that, because it turns out, as I discovered, a lot of people listen to his podcast. Yeah, let me say one thing, just to try to do what I think you would applaud, given that you may be more attuned to the value of good messaging than I am. Which is to try to establish the stakes and I hope not over dramatize the situation. But my view is that it's close to literally true that if we are going to save the world, people, some substantial number of people, including influential ones, but not only those, are going to have to move at least somewhat closer to enlightenment in the Buddhist sense of the term. I don't mean, get there. I view enlightenment as kind of a spectrum, awakening, kind of a spectrum. And I think you can move short distances in that direction. And I think when you, to get back to jargon a little, when you do, even partly, neutralize or erode your cognitive biases, that can be a form of taking a step in the direction of enlightenment. But I do think that the stakes are this high. I think there's so many problems facing nations collectively and people collectively that are problems that are collectively existential. That is, if they all go unsolved, it could be, kablooey, the end of the whole thing. That we need to do a much better job of working together. And when I look at the things that are keeping us from working together, keeping nations from working together, I think it really does come back to distortions of perception and cognition of the kind that psychologists call cognitive biases, and of the kind that meditation practice can help address. Not to say that's the only way to address them, but I think there is a big intersection there between the, the kind of the aspiration of Buddhist practice and what the world needs.
And I don't know how much of this research there is, but I did find a very interesting study that was, I think, done in 2013, titled "Debiasing the Mind with Mindfulness Meditation," I couldn't see that. Wasn't granted access to the specifics of the study, but the abstract suggested that mindfulness meditators were less prone to sunk cost fallacy, the sunk cost bias.
That's interesting. Sunk cost, by the way, is it's sometimes called the Concord fallacy, because from older people remember the Concorde. It was I guess a boondoggle. It was a jet that was put together by Europe, and it flew faster than the speed of sound, so it could get you from like the U.S. to Paris. And I once took it. I didn't pay for it, but I couldn't afford it. But I once took it, and it was fast. I mean, it was like, a couple of hours. But it was so small that you couldn't get that many people on it, so it wasn't profitable. And the idea was, it became kind of clear early on that it was not going to be economically feasible. But people said, we put so much into it, you can't stop. Look at how much we've invested. And the sunk cost fallacy is that kind of thinking, because a good economist will tell you, look, it doesn't matter how much you've put into it. The way to think of it is, how much am I going to have to put into it from here on out, and what is going to be the payoff? And if it's not going to if it's not justified in those terms, get out. Is there a more recent modern geopolitical move that speaks to that too? Do you mean like wars we're immersed in, or I guess or finally get unimmersed in, or
exactly.
Yeah,
Afghanistan.
No, I think we all face that in our lives. It's like I don't want to get too confessional, but I mean, there are career things I think about, that like, should I really keep doing this? well, I put so much into it,
Well, in finding that study, the reason I got directed to it is because I was just Googling around, looking up things around loss aversion, which is another one of these biases. And the one of the findings that I came to was that loss aversion was kind of the taproot from which, sunk cost fallacy and the endowment effect, where you value things that you own more than the market value of it might be, or status quo bias. You get sort of entrained to the status quo. Like all of that is those are all eminent or manifestations of loss aversion, which is just this sense that losses loom more heavily than comparable gains.
Yeah. Like the experimental test of that is like, I have this mug. Do I have a mug? Well, no, I have a glass. Here's a glass. And you say, how much would it cost for you to part with that? And let's say it has no obvious emotional value, and there's one exactly like it I can buy. And it turns out that, people will demand much more than the replacement cost for the glass. There's just something about letting go of something. They could make money by saying, okay, take it for $10. I can buy another one for $5, but, they tend not to want to do that.
There's maybe this is imprecise language, but there's something about what happens in the relationship to the object when the designator of the word mine is connected to it. So when it's my mug, right, suddenly it has greater value.
Right.
And you can extrapolate that out to my views, my relationship, my work, my nation's perspective, whatever. All of that over-endows the entity with more value.
Right. So there are all of these, kind of cognitive biases, and then famous ones like confirmation bias, noticing and embracing evidence that supports your worldview, either not noticing or finding reasons to reject evidence that's at odds with your worldview. There's a number of these. I wasn't aware of that study, debiasing the mind, and I've wondered how much there is in the way of empirical evidence that maybe mindfulness meditation could help erode some of these cognitive biases. It seems to me intuitively that it should be able to help.
Right. Intuitively, it seems to be able to help. And that's one thing that I would, in talking to you, I would be, as a meditator and as a proponent of meditation, I would be interested in, it seems like this could be tested more comprehensively. Like, have you heard of anyone describing a cognitive bias evaluation or a cognitive bias test where it's like any layperson could just go online, kind of like a Briggs-Myers test, and do a kind of a series of question answer or problems that evaluate how strongly you are swayed by these perceptual biases?
I'm not aware of one, and I can imagine that it would be kind of hard to construct, but I'm not aware of one, no. Because
one thing, like, if you're interested in getting your worldview, particularly around people becoming more conscious of these biases and less susceptible to them, having some sort of quantitative research that validates whatever intervention you're offering, in this case mindfulness, would be, I think, helpful. Yeah, it would be nice. Let me say one thing quickly about why it's my intuition that at least some cognitive biases might be susceptible to kind of lessening via mindfulness meditation. And that's that, although we call them cognitive biases, I think they tend to involve affect. Yep. Right.
They tend to involve feelings, emotion. And, if you pay attention, if you're on Twitter or on social media and you can see confirmation bias at work, and the way it shows up is you'll see somebody tweet some piece of evidence that supports your worldview. And if you pay close attention, and you may be better at this if you do mindfulness meditation, but in any event, if you pay close attention, I think you'll see that it makes you a little happy to see that. It's a feeling to see evidence that supports your worldview. And you kind of have affection for the information. I mean, you just, there's almost literally an embrace of the information, a welcoming of the information. And that makes you inclined to kind of share it without critical inspection, even like, retweet it, whatever. Whereas if you see information at odds with your worldview, there's a bit of aversion to it, almost hostility toward it, that inclines you to critically inspect it. It's like, oh yeah, well, let me see, like what study supposedly showed that this is true? And you go and you read the study and you find the flaw, but you don't do that with information that you embrace. And it really does. I think this reaction is mediated by the simple feelings of attraction and aversion. And of course, that's one thing mindfulness meditation makes you more aware of and makes you less susceptible to, in principle, by virtue of your awareness of it. And so go ahead.
I've been trying to think about that in different ways too, because I think I agree with you. I think these biases don't announce themselves as a little blip on your radar that says you are now being influenced by attribution, or you're now being influenced by confirmation bias. They get channeled through a feeling. You either feel better or worse, or happy or annoyed or agitated by something. But the slippery slope is that those feelings are very quick, they're very fast, and they're also so habitual in a certain sense, where it's like the water that we're swimming in that we don't even notice. To use that, right. The David right. Foster Wallace idea of the fish swimming in water that doesn't know what the water is. And as a result, the views that are born from those feelings feel self-evident, or have a maybe you could say epistemic validity to them, like a truthfulness to them that is just not questioned. Mm-hmm. And to do so, to actually interrogate that, brings the person engaged with that process into I think a profound state of discomfort. It's not comfortable to question a cherished view or to question a cherished position.
That's right. And mindfulness can, in principle, help you just live with the feeling of discomfort, to a point where it becomes less painful. It's just there. And it's no longer such an obstacle to trying to see the situation clearly. And that's why I would think, now I would say experiments would be hard to do that get at any of these things, but I'd be really surprised if it is the case, leaving aside how experimentally verifiable it is or how easy it is to verify. I'd really be surprised if it's the case that mindfulness meditation can't help with any cognitive biases at all. Now, my question to you is, the conversation we've just had, and let's set aside the part about experimental verification. Just when we were describing the cognitive biases at work and how you can become more aware of them and how meditation can help, was that to you not a sufficiently user-friendly way of describing them? Because I know, part of the reason you want to talk to me about these things is you think that they can be made more, some of them at least, can be made more user-friendly than I'm making them.
It's hard to say, because I have my own sample size of one. So it didn't necessarily feel too jargony to me. But, even the phrase cognitive bias, on the general population level, I'm not sure how tangible that concept is. And particularly at the level of influencing perception and behavior. Like and so I really what I'm more interested in trying to get you to consider is to create stories or to analyze specific kitchen table type scenarios, like we were talking about with the cup and how much you evaluate the cup or value the cup. But to take examples that people could relate to in kind of in their own lives at a very simple level, and then extrapolate or grow out from that to showing how the same dynamic gets played out at, say, a geopolitical level.
Right.
I think that the connection, the bridge between those will, and so that where people can see that overcoming the bias in their personal life leads to maybe a more a better outcome that they would self-define. Because that was when the insights that really hit me from Dan Ariely's work, the behavioral economist who was at MIT. I think he's now down at Duke.
Yeah.
He became famous for his book Predictably Irrational, which is that just showing how these biases get people to make decisions that are against their self-interest in predictable ways. And against the values that they themselves espouse that they hold.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
So do you see what I'm saying? But if you can see
but I do think there are two separate issues. I think, in other words, you're saying we need practical applications. We need people. I think there's two kinds of practical applications you can give people. One is in the kind of self-help realm. Your life can be better if you think more clearly, and here are some ways to do it, and see the world more clearly. Another realm of practical application is the whole world can be better if we as citizens process the news more clearly. There might be fewer wars. We might make more inroads on climate change and so on. And I think you have to do one or both of those. I think happily it is, I believe it's the case. And in a way, Buddhist doctrine says it's the case, that those two things dovetail. In other words, seeing the world more clearly can help you and help the world. And that's good news. I would say all of that, I think, is a separate issue from things like, from the question of, well, is cognitive bias a term you should use? Because you could use that term and talk about the practical applications, or you could not use that term and still talk about the practical applications. I think that's a separate question. And I think the question of whether you use terms like cognitive bias partly depends on your audience. I think, sure. I mean, my feeling is that there is an audience, and these are, on balance, better educated people and so on, and maybe even people of particular ideological persuasions, I don't know. But there is a demographic, and I think a somewhat influential demographic, that is more attuned to and interested in the concept of cognitive biases than was the case 30 years ago. Almost nobody had heard that term. It was in the literature, but almost nobody had heard it. Now you can find lots of people who have heard it. And I think they may resonate to some of this. And I think kind of separate from that, it can help to convey certain ideas in scientific language, right? For some people, that lends real authority, and so I would say that I think for
no
a certain audience, a certain amount of technical terminology is actually a good thing.
Oh, it's mandatory for a certain audience.
Yeah.
The question is, if you are, and I feel like I'm paraphrasing what I've read in your newsletter, but if in facing these existential psychological threats, if a key part of the solution, i.e. survival of the species, is an advance in moral evolution, then it would, it would seem that a larger percentage of the population would have to be somewhat swayed into this different perspective. And I was thinking of the example of like sort of the perceptual blind spot that people are made aware of when they take a driving certification test. you know, and how to mitigate the impact of that perceptual or that perceptual blind spot.
Well, wait, what is the perceptual blind spot in that context?
Sort of,
oh, you mean the reason you look in your side rear view mirror because there's the blind spot way if you're going to change lanes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
Right.
That's one. But you know, but just the existence of that is something that most people don't even take into consideration or don't even think about it until it's pointed out to them.
Or until they almost kill themselves.
Right. One or the other.
Yeah.
So it's sort of getting the whole domain of cognitive bias to the level of the average person that they're starting to think about how is this influencing day-to-day decisions, whether it's around economics or interpersonal relationship. Because I agree with you in the sense that I think the root of conflict in the human mind heart is the seed of the conflicts we see in the world. Right?
Wait, wait a second. Say that again. The root of conflict
that we find in the human heart, the root of intrapersonal conflict.
Okay, is the same as
is just writ large at a larger scale in the world's conflicts.
I think that's certainly true. Yes.
I think that's one premise of Buddhism, that the seeds of conflict.
Yeah, and that it's I think Buddhism would go further and say it's the root of suffering. It's the root of, like, even if you were on a desert island and weren't interacting with people on any level, you would under certain circumstances maybe suffer needlessly as a result of some of the same things. But I think I'm getting a little arcane here. So go ahead and forget I said
No,
that.
actually that relates to part of my own staycation at the end of August here in Maine. You know, I basically wanted to.
What's the definition of a staycation? I may be on one and don't know it. Oh, you have to actually live there full time?
I don't know if those that keep track of staycations mandate that you have to stay where your primary residence the whole time. But basically, I was at my my only residence for a few weeks, and my intention was just to unplug and disengage from normal workaday things. But so this is my proverbial desert island. And just like a meditation retreat where you kind of confront the momentum of all the energy and activity of your day to day when you slow down and stop. I experienced the same thing. I wasn't doing an intensive meditation retreat, but just trying to take away many of the distracting or engaging things that I do for normal life. And it just like a retreat, it brought up a ton of anxiety. And it was just a raw form of anxiety that I can't really attribute to any one. I mean, I was safe. I was just chilling out, hanging around, but the feeling that I should be doing something, I'm not doing enough, I'm not extracting enough from my time, all of that came up for a while. And I think that's what, you know, it was like, it sort of became an informal retreat for me in a sense, similar to what might happen on an intensive Buddhist retreat, in that I had to look at that energy and just in its raw form. And so I think that's what you're speaking to. Like the desert island, you can see the suffering you could generate yourself on the desert island that was needless.
Yeah. I mean, I was also thinking of, like, suppose you're on a desert island with an infinite supply of powdered sugar donuts. And
I was wondering, I wrote down, Bob, this is synchronistic. Yeah. I wrote down something about powdered sugar donuts today, wondering if I would mention this.
It's my favorite example.
And then you go
of gluttony, because it's a form of gluttony I wouldn't mind engaging in for the rest of my life if there was no downside. But the hunger that keeps you eating them and kind of being in a way perennially recurringly dissatisfied. Right? You eat one, it's great, but then you want another one, and then finally, I guess you get nauseous or something. But anyway, the root of overindulgence is and the root of I guess the dissatisfaction after indulgence is the kind of grasping that is in a way the root of confirmation bias. In other words, you're grasping, you want to hold on to that thing that confirms your bias. That's that confirms your worldview. That's the connection I was kind of thinking about when I said.
I'm not sure I followed the logic between grasping after a sugar or a powdered donut and grasping after a worldview or
grasping after evidence that supports your worldview. In the case of confirmation bias, I mean the whole issue is attraction and aversion. You know, in Buddhism, you know, the three poisons, so-called three poisons, is often translated as greed, hatred, and delusion, and that works very well for that translation works very well for a lot of purposes, especially you know, kind of a modern progressive sensibility. Like, yeah, greed is bad, capitalism is bad, hatred is bad, war is bad, but those aren't actually good translations. I mean, you know, a better translation would be a more generic kind of, not greed just in the sense of money, but a grasping kind of attraction, you know, a thirst, a tanha. And then the hatred would be more like just aversion, you know, not just aversion to people you don't like, aversion, like the pushing away, the hostile attitude toward anything, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that's the generic root of so much, you know, anyway, that's my view. That's the connection I see between powdered sugar donuts and confirmation bias is.
So let me try to reflect that back. So a word that I've been thinking of more in the context of greed or desire is the pattern of addiction,
mm-hmm.
where when you obtain the object that you desire, and you know this better than I do, but there's going to be a neurochemical response of dopamine reward, which doesn't last very long and gets you wanting that next mm-hmm. blip of dopamine mm-hmm. response. And then the addiction steps in when you continue to seek or enact that behavior in spite of adverse consequences. I think that's a modern working definition of addiction, like repeated behavior in spite of adverse consequences. So in the case of the donuts, you know, you can still grasp after these in spite of feeling like shit or putting on extra weight or mm-hmm. feeling really sluggish. What's the adverse, like, how do you translate that to the adverse consequences of confirmation bias that may not be as visible, palpable, tangible as, say, what happens when you binge on powdered sugar donuts?
Well, I mean, at the macro level, if you're concerned about the fate of society and the world, I think everyone having confirmation bias leads to, first of all, what's called, you know, this pathological polarization is one term for it in American politics today. Some people would use the term tribalism. And then, also like war. I mean, you know, wars tend to result from mass cognitive biases, you know, of various kinds, and in a very loose sense of the term. I mean, for example, fear, the way fear can distort your perception, may or may not plug into some of the classic cognitive biases like confirmation bias. It can, I think. But in any event, it has a distorting view on your perception. And one thing that happens is nations start fearing one another, and then they see, and a nation does something to allay its fear. It takes some defensive measure that it sees as defensive. The other nation sees it as threatening and offensive. Oh, you know, more nuclear weapons, you know, are offensive from our point of view. You may see them as protective. And so you get into this cycle of increased fear. Now, maybe that example may not seem to follow so closely on the powdered sugar donuts, but well, you tell me. What is your level of dissatisfaction with what I just said? I'll try to address it.
No, I'm not dissatisfied with what you said. I agree. It's more two things. If I can remember them both. One is, can you spell that out? Can you walk me through that in either in a contemporary or historical actual example where you see that those dynamics at play? I forgot the other point that I had. So, I mean, how does, and I think this maybe loops back to the loss aversion bit, because the fear is that if an action isn't taken, if there isn't an escalation of defense, or if there isn't some intervention taken as a response to some provocation, that the fear is that something you value, something you hold and cherish is going to be lost.
Mm-hmm.
Like that, I think that's that becomes a unifying, depolarizing, the uniquely weird depolarizing issues in the United States, where there's bilateral support for either something to do with either China or Afghanistan. Like there's rare bipartisan support, which I remember hearing you speak with Ezra Klein about, that itself becomes problematic around squashing or repressing dissenting voices. And so you can maybe speak to this better than I can, but how does the response to fear activate the kind of biases that then become a feedback loop? This is what we're kind of trying to get to, is how does it become a negative feedback loop?
Yeah. I mean, in a way, there's two feedback loops involved. There's the one that's only on your side of the equation. So let's take an example that's, for the moment, not geopolitical. You had talked about fear of losing something. In everyday life, one of the things we're most afraid of losing is status. So if we have some kind of professional rival that we think wants to undermine us, right? Somebody we think kind of wishes us ill, and they're trying to do things to damage our career, damage our status. Maybe they just want some job we have. They want to be the best in some realm where we want to be the best. Or maybe we're pursuing the same mate or something, right? And that certainly is a zero-sum game. And here the feedback loop is that, okay, you start suspecting them of doing things to undermine you. That's now your thesis. Confirmation bias can lead you to see evidence of this undermining where it's not. In reading the things they do and imputing motivations to them, you start building up all of this evidence of their how threatening they are, that may not actually be valid. But the more evidence you build up, the more fearful you are, and the more inclined you are to see evidence. Okay, so there's that kind of feedback loop on one side, and that can apply at the international level. Oh, China is the enemy. They wish us ill. I'm suddenly attuned to evidence that that's the case. And the more evidence I see, the more scared I am, and the more evidence I'm going to see. So there's that feedback loop, but there's also the bilateral feedback loop, which is that we get fearful and actually do things that we think of as assuaging our fear. Oh, we're going to send a destroyer, into waters we have not traditionally sent destroyers into, just to send them a message that they shouldn't invade Taiwan or whatever. This is just a defensive, from somebody's point of view, ours or Taiwan's, it's a defensive measure, okay? It doesn't mean we're going to invade them or anything, but then they may take that as an offensive measure. This is a famous thing, I think the term is in international relations, a security dilemma, which is, you want to do things that make you feel more secure, but then they may make the other side feel more threatened. And you want to, you think if we build a few more nuclear weapons, that'll be a more effective deterrent to their nuclear weapons. But then they feel vulnerable and build more nuclear weapons. So there's that feedback loop as well. And, in both cases, you can, both kinds of feedback loops, the kind of unilateral one that's happening within your own head and the bilateral one can play out both at the geopolitical level and at the interpersonal level. You have your personal rivals, you have your geopolitical threats. It's kind of the same thing. And I think you would probably encourage me to, in a way, emphasize that, right? I mean, emphasize both the kind of personal self-helpy applications and the geopolitical world-helpy applications.
Yeah, and the reason around that suggestion for messaging is I think the more that people can tangibly see these biases play out in their own life, I think it will lead to the kind of perspective taking, at least, immediately in their own life, that you would like to see more and more in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that it becomes, you get sort of, I think of it like a training wheel thing. If you can start to see it in your own world, your own immediate life, how one of these biases might lead to poor interaction or poor decisions, poor choices, and then really get it's just a felt sense of it, of how it plays out. Then you can start to seeing it more in international conflict, for example, or political polarization.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's challenging. There are rivals. There are people who wish you ill. That's a true fact. It's not totally in your head. It's just, but the question is, to what extent is dwelling on that going to actually warp your worldview and get you to imagine, threats that aren't there, or threats that are bigger than they are? And B, just how much is it going to make you suffer? The whole, one thing to remember is that the whole, and this I find people resonate with when you talk about the environment that some of our impulses were designed by natural selection for, as opposed to the modern environment. In a hunter-gatherer environment, the classic example is kind of rage, the retributive impulse, and you see somebody, you see road rage playing out. And it's like, this is crazy. Why are you speeding up to bring this guy to justice? What are you going to do when you catch the person? This can only lead to bad things for you or no things at all, right? Either you won't catch the person or won't do anything, or you'll do something that just won't be good for you. Where did that come from? Well, in a hunter-gatherer environment, it very often made sense to, if people tried to steal something from you, disrespect you, it can make sense to challenge them, and even if you incur some short-term loss, even if you get beat up a little in the course of trying to beat them up, in a pragmatic way, that can make sense, because you're living in a world where everyone who is observing this is somebody you deal with, okay? You're sending a message to everybody. Whereas on a highway...
At a scale where that message is received.
Right, exactly. And in the modern world, you got to ask yourself, if I go around fuming, and I actually do this, I know this from experience, I do fume about people. Okay? It's funny. It's not funny. It's kind of sad. I do this Friday podcast with this old friend of mine, Mickey Kaus, who turns out to have been a Trump supporter, in the sense of having voted for him and so on. So there's a certain amount of tension. And we do a podcast that's open to the public, And then we do one that's behind a Patreon paywall called the Parrot Room. And pretty recently, I've really gone off in the Parrot Room, where I feel a little more secure. Like it's a much smaller, more intimate environment, about some of my professional rivals. Well, or people, well, not just rivals, but people I think have actively sought to do me harm. I mean, basically one person. But, and first of all, in asking myself why I did that, I think part of it is that when I went on vacation, it actually disrupted my meditation practice. I think I was less equanimous and more prone to that kind of thing. But anyway, the take home is like, what good is that doing me? It's, fuming about some person is probably not doing much damage to them. Right. So, and in any event, it's not sending the message. It's not like, how many people listening to this are thinking, well, I better not mess with Bob. I mean, how many of them were going to do that? How many of them were in a position to do that, to damage me, right? It's like, it just doesn't make sense. And I've now wandered a little distance from, the original example, but the generic take home is, one thing to keep in mind is these impulses that guide us were designed for a very different environment. So they may have actually made sense in a self-helpy way sometimes in the environment they were designed for, and not make sense, even in a selfish way now.
And that was, I think I brought that up the last Dharma of Bob episode we had. You gave me the phrase mismatch theory, which I think is a really important one. And that's kind of the idea of like a basic concept that I think I would like a lot of people to have in their head a little bit more.
And I apologize for no doubt repeating the road rage example for like the 50th time. But it's such a clear cut one.
That was not on repeat, I don't think, by my memory. But one specific to the broader topic here, is around, you mentioned, if I heard you correctly, it sounded like venting that rage in the Parrot Room, you said it had a negative impact on your meditation?
No, it's the other way around. I realized I taped that shortly after relocating and starting my vacation. And the relocation had kind of disrupted my meditation practice. I didn't bring my cushion and have my place where I do it in the morning, and I had gotten kind of undisciplined about it. I just wasn't doing it much. And I think that was part of it. But in terms of the effect of the rant, it just made me suffer. I just felt silly. And I felt it wasn't it wasn't the example I want to set either. It wasn't good.
Well, if I can reframe it, I would say I think it is exactly the example you're trying to set, which is not the actual behavior of ranting, but the retrospective almost contrition around the rant, and seeing the drawbacks and limitations of what the ranting does to you. Mm-hmm. I think that's, and I think that's just something that people may not appreciate about how the meditation can work. And that if you're aware of that kind of dynamic, that's not bad meditation. Now you're seeing the kind of the immediate impact that the bias and then the strong feelings that these biases generate, how that impacts and affects your state of being.
Yeah.
One selfish question that I haven't been able to figure out and this is off topic a little bit, but it relates to the Parrot Room, is the Parrot Room only available by going to the Substack Nonzero page?
There's actually two ways. If you subscribe to the Nonzero newsletter, you get access to the videos and the audios. There's one thing you don't get access to that way, which is just the comment section on Patreon. You can, you could comment on Substack, on when we put out the Parrot Room, there's a place you can comment, but that hasn't really gotten critical mass. And, because most of the Parrot Room, we just crossed the 1,000 mark. So there's 1,000 people actually, paying for the Patreon access. I mean, separate from the ones who have access to the content by virtue of subscribing to the newsletter. And then, I mean, if you want me to get into the gory details, there's a slightly higher Patreon level, that in turn gives you access to the paid version of the newsletter. So it's more complicated than it should be, but that's the answer to your question. Yeah.
Well, the follow-up simple question is, have you considered distributing the Parrot Room audio in podcast form as a member-only feed?
What's there? You get that as a newsletter subscriber.
But is there an RSS feed or?
Yes. And okay. the same at Patreon. If you want to, if you just follow the link in the Friday Nonzero newsletter I send out, at the bottom, there's a link that gets you to a place that it should be self-explanatory what you do from there to create a podcast feed that is the Parrot Room on your podcast app by using the RSS. Yeah.
Okay. That's I have not figured that out yet, and I'm
okay. And are you getting access through the newsletter?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So I should maybe make that clearer. But if you go to the Friday newsletter, scroll to the bottom and click, it should be clear. We're at fault if it's not. I mean, there's a place it takes you to a place on Substack where the Substack people
give some tutorial on how to
created an interface that should make it clear. Yes.
Okay. I'll look into that. So a couple of directions to go, but I know you wanted to give an update about your own practice at some point, and I don't know if that would feed in here.
So we had talked about this in past conversations. The challenge for me of, because of the pandemic, not being able to go to, your classic week-long, 10-day-long meditation retreat every couple of years, because I think I had become kind of dependent on that to recharge my daily practice. It's like I come out of a retreat, I'm feeling very, quote, good at meditation. That's a way you're not supposed to talk. But, in other words, I don't have a hard time, kind of like, if I'm starting by my session by focusing on the breath, I don't have a hard time with that. I naturally sink into a pretty mindful state without much difficulty, because a meditation retreat, in my experience, really, there's a reason they call it practice, and a meditation retreat is intensive practice, and the skill level improves. But then it can fade over a year or two, and so you go back, you get it recharged. And in the absence of that recharge, I felt my practice had become kind of difficult. And I think I've found a partial solution. One is just lower your expectations. Not demand that you attain some blissful state every time, or even anywhere near every time. Just accept it for what it is. As I think I told you last time, for me,
pause there. Isn't that the essence of the practice itself? To not grasp or reach for any particular state?
It is and it isn't. But I think yes. But I will say,
because when you say lowering your expectations, I hear you're actually aligning the intention of the practice now with the heart of it.
Yeah. At the same time, I think there's an aspect, a feature of kind of the modern American approach to mindfulness meditation that hasn't always and everywhere been such a big part of it. And that's like, self-compassion, forgiveness. I mean, as you know, you can find, you can find very harsh admonitions and reprimands in the ancient literature, and you can find the insistence that you be harder on yourself. There's that, and
I can speak firsthand. I worked with, I think, the Burmese teacher who is one of the most aggressive taskmasters in that vein that you're describing, Sayadaw U Pandita. He just, he would basically say, Henry, you cannot try hard enough, and he would say you're wasting your time by not trying harder.
Okay. Preach it, brother.
Well, but that's the thing. I think most people that have gone through that system, including myself, it's, that might work in that particular context. And there's been suggestions that because Asians subscribe to a doctrine of reincarnation, that they don't feel the fire under their tush quite as much as Westerners who only maybe believe in one life is all you get.
That seems pretty far-fetched, frankly. But anyway, I personally, let me put it another way. It's like, I remember my first meditation retreat. I was frustrated because I couldn't focus on I'd never had, meditated much at all. And I was trying hard to focus on my breaths. I couldn't, I would get to 4, 5, 6, 7, 11, and then lose focus, and then realize I had lost focus and get mad at myself. And of course, the meditation teacher, when I had a check-in 2 or 3 days into the retreat, said, no, it's good. I mean, every time you notice that you've quit noticing your breath, that's victory. So first of all, look at it that way. But and I would say relatedly, I did start giving myself what in golf is called a mulligan.
Yeah, I just want to pause you on that. So
yeah,
I mean, I don't want to lose this because, and I forgive me if we've talked about this before, but what the teacher said about seeing yourself get lost, I think that itself is, central to your Dharma in a certain sense, because at the root of these biases is the conviction of the I that has them that's correct. And when you see yourself get lost and wake up to it, that erodes. I mean, first off, did you intend to get lost? And the answer is going to be no. No one focusing on their breath intends to get lost in some kind of thought stream or fantasy or whatever. But to see that happens again erodes bit by bit. It just chips away at the edifice of sort of the sense of self that sees itself in control of everything.
At the same time.
Okay.
I mean, it's true on this meditation retreat that being a little more forgiving of myself helped. Okay. Like I was saying, in golf, there's this thing called a mulligan, which is when you're playing casually with friends. You can, on one hole, you get to choose at one point during the day, you hit a bad drive and you just say, I'm not counting that. I'm going to hit another drive. Okay. That's a mulligan. I'm taking a mulligan. You get 1 per 18 holes when you're playing among friends. And I started thinking of it that way. I started thinking like, okay, if I get to 7 breaths and then realize, oh shit, I lost it. I haven't been counting. I lost it at 7. I'm just going to start at 8. I'm not going to go back to 1. I'm going to start at 8. I get to do that once. Okay. Each time I start at 1, I get to lose myself and not take off, credit for it and have to start at 0. I can go, oh, lost it at 7. Okay. 8, 9, 10. And so I gave myself that degree of forgiveness. And it worked, but it worked in the sense that I got better at focusing on my breath because I still had the aspiration to focus on my breath. And focusing successfully on my breath brought me absolutely massive rewards, okay? In terms of the rest of the retreat and the things that happened and attaining greater mindfulness, and even on that retreat, attaining much more dramatic things than just classic mindfulness. And what I want to say is, if if the forgiveness or the casualness of your approach gets to the point where you've lost the aspiration to focus on your breath, that can be okay. Because as I told you last time, worst case for me is better than average mind wandering. That's not a loss if that's what the day is, you know? But at the same time, there are places you can get by establishing a certain degree of focus that you're not going to get otherwise. So if you just sit down every day and your mind wanders and you say, well, Josh said that's fine. This is success. This is victory. And you get up. It is fine, and it's better than not sitting down. At the same time, there are depths you can get to through successful focus that you're not going to get to otherwise. And you're kidding yourself if you say, well, there just are no, everything is victory. It's like everyone gets a participation trophy.
The gloves are about to come off, Bob.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, but I really feel this strongly.
Okay, no, I can feel your strong feeling on this. The thing I would question is the phrase, the only way to get focused is by focusing on the breath. Or
no,
I
did not even remotely say that. I did not utter that phrase. I did not utter that phrase because for one thing, you can, in fact, you can focus on all kinds of things, first of all, to establish concentration. The classic text on mindfulness, of course.
But you are saying to get concentrated, and maybe we can use some other words for concentration, but a sense of stillness, a sense of unmoving presence.
Right.
Undistracted awareness.
Right.
Those are phrases that would fit to, I think, what you're intoning with concentration.
Right. That
the way to get to that is through applied focused attention on something. Is that accurate? To what you're saying? For me, alternatives to that have not worked. And I would say further, that is, of course, the prescription in the classic mindfulness text, the Satipatthana Sutta. It's, you don't have to focus on your breath, but you focus on something. Focus on part of your body, you focus on this, you focus on that. That is a text that emphasizes focus. Okay, if you want to go into the text, then okay, and also the fourth foundation gets you focusing on the hindrances. So and by what I mean by bringing that up is that classically speaking, the experience of stillness, the experience of undistracted attention arises when the hindrances are not operative. So when the hindrances of desire, the hindrances of aversion, the restlessness, the drowsiness, the sleepiness, the doubt, when those energies are not operating in your mind, the experience is one of unified presence. And so, no, hang on.
I mean, that's your assertion. I just don't know exactly what that means. And I don't know if it would be the case for me, but.
Well, it's something that I've discussed with colleagues in the meditative world and listened to students too, that you're essentially describing a path to stillness. Mm-hmm. And the path is focus on something. When your mind wanders, maybe give yourself a mulligan, but come back to that thing that your mind has wandered from. And you're right that is a conventional way that practice is taught, in the West even.
Well,
and that's,
it's a conventional way mindfulness is taught. We should say, of course, there are totally other traditions. There's Zen meditation that doesn't involve that, and might well get you to stillness. And I'm not saying it won't.
I'm saying the same tradition though, in the same Theravada tradition.
Okay.
Contemporary teacher would say, focus first on these challenging mind states, and get to know them. And so that's where what I was trying to recommend last time is being a little bit looser in the practice to really let the full bloom of these quote unquote distractive energies of mind become into your consciousness and let them be known. So there's familiarity, brought to them or developed within them. And because I think that's what really happens on a retreat anyway, is that you go on retreat. The first several days are utter hell usually because people experience the full brunt of all of those habitual energies, of pushing away, grabbing after something pleasant in their mind. And it's the tool of the breath is a way to step out of the ferocity of that stream, and to give yourself a stable place that you can rest on. But that's just one avenue into the experience of presence. You could still, I would argue, explore and get to know desire as you're encouraging people to explore, to understand the impact of that feeling, and to wake up out of being identified with the feeling and having greater presence to the feeling. In doing that, you start to feel the intrinsic stillness of presence with the hindrance.
Wait, in doing what? What is the substitute for focusing on your breath? Focusing on the hindrance?
If the hindrance is there, yeah, focusing on the hindrance.
Okay, and what are the hindrances again?
The 5 hindrances are desire. So here's your greed, aversion, your hatred, restlessness, low energy or sleepiness, and doubt. Even that takes effort. Even that takes effort and aspiration. Right. It's a different way of coming to the same kind of condition, I think. So it's a different way of coming to presence. And this is something I learned at IMS with teachers, like Steve Armstrong, Camo Masters, who had worked with a Burmese teacher, Sayadaw U Tejaniya, who shifted this as a way of building samadhi.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, particularly on a retreat, and I would say this could apply to a daily sitting practice in ordinary conditions, because the beginning of a retreat is probably going to be more similar to what daily sitting experiences are like for most people. You don't have the momentum of buildup of mindfulness that a retreat brings when you sit down to your cushion every day or sit down in your everyday life. So and this is what I was trying to get at, maybe not so well in our last time we tried to talk about this, but if you're trying to use the breath as the doorway into undistracted presence,
mm-hmm.
and you see your mind slipping off the breath all the time, that I think brings you into the situation of your frustration with your practice.
Yeah. I actually don't even do that. And in fact, I was going to say, for me, the twofold partial solution to my problem has been, A, kind of lower my expectations a little in the morning meditation, but B, I've set my my smartwatch for a time in the evening that leads me to do a second short meditation. And on that meditation, I don't even think about the breath. I mean, in general, if I can really pay attention to anything in a sustained way, that's victory. Like, I don't divide it into the 5 hindrances, but because there's all kinds of things that can show up that, I don't want to get started thinking, wait, which hindrance would this, it's like you can feel anxiety, you can feel restlessness in your leg, you can feel all kinds of things that get your attention. And in fact, one approach to mindfulness that a teacher I did a retreat with suggested is just sit down and see what presents itself to your awareness most prominently. Could be a feeling, could be a sound, whatever, and just work from there. And by the way, one thing I've found is that if you do that and confine it to the body, it's just like, what is it in your body that gets your attention? You often wind up, you can get led back to the breath, because almost every feeling in your body, a lot of feelings in your body are actually going to fluctuate in accordance with your breath if you pay attention. But anyway, all that aside, any kind of focus that I attain, I consider kind of a good thing. And one thing I like about that second meditation session is, by that time in the day, there's kind of more going on in a certain sense. I don't know, it's hard to explain. It's like sometimes in the morning, it's like my whole being is so mushy. It's like there's nothing jumping out encouraging you to notice it. I don't know if that makes sense. But by the end of the day, there may be anxieties, there may be frustrations, there may be this, there may be that. And you sit down and there are just more things with edges to pick up on, you know?
That makes sense.
It's like sometimes I say that, in a way, in a certain sense, maybe anxiety is easier to deal with than sadness because it has edges. It's like, you know, you can successfully become aware of either in a way that helps neutralize it for practical purposes, but anxiety is really there. Like it's got an edge. But anyway, so I want to say it's not that, oh wow, if I didn't count 30 breaths, that's failure. It's that if I sit down in the morning and don't become particularly aware of anything, that's failure. And I am not going to let go of the word failure. You can try to make me let go of it, Josh. Ain't going to happen. Because you do meditate for a reason. There is in some sense a goal. And whenever there's a goal, there's the possibility of not reaching it. Sorry.
Well, this is where there's that paradox of meditation. What is the goal, Bob?
Well, you can describe it at many levels. You can say, well, the goal is to improve my life. How does it improve your life? Well, it gives me more equanimity, or it makes me more aware of feelings that are leading me into a bad place and less inclined to follow them. You can describe the goal in all kinds of ways, but there is a goal. You don't meditate for no reason at all.
I'm not saying that.
I'll tell you, there are people who come pretty damn close to saying it if you examine the implications of the way they're talking about it.
Well, you know, to respond directly to what you're just reporting from your practice, you know, the phrase that U Pandita would use, and, you know, and I got this
wait, he's the harsh of the Burmese?
He was the hardcore guy. He's no longer alive, but he was the lion of.
God, I wish he should have been my teacher.
Yeah. It was,
I would have gotten along famously with him.
He played some psychological warfare, but he would say again and again, the only task of the meditator is to be aware of the object that's arising moment to moment. Whatever objects are present. So when you're sitting in the morning feeling unfocused, and this is coming back to, if you want to be doctrinaire, quote the Satipatthana Sutta, this is in the third foundation, to be aware of the unfocused or distracted mind. That's the practice. It's not to have an absence of distraction. It's, if there's distraction there, to know that distraction is present, because it's the knowing that the recognition that there's an awareness knowing the distraction that's being developed. That's the goal, the awareness itself, just to remember, recollect, to feel the impact of just what awareness is. And the awareness isn't defined by, your awareness is no different from when it's present to the breath or when it's present to the distraction. The quality of knowing, the mindfulness that's arising that recognizes both of those is identical.
So even you would agree that if you fail to become aware even of that, you have failed.
You're really pinning me down. I would say if you're aware of the fact that you failed, you succeeded. If you're aware of the fact that you feel that you failed.
What if you're not even aware of the fact you failed? What if the bell goes off, it's been 20, 30, 40 minutes, and only then you go, oh shit. I wasn't aware of a single fucking thing.
But then you're aware of the fact that you weren't aware of a single fucking thing.
So that moment I don't think that moment is actually going to do me very much good as a practical matter. I don't think that moment is going to improve my life. If 40 minutes happens, the bell goes off and I go, man, that was 40 minutes of unawareness. I just don't seeing that lead to like better social relations and the end of war. I'm sorry.
No, not immediately. Not immediately. Yeah. But it's what I'm trying to get to or express is that the attitude that the mindset you want to go into the practice with is one that is inclusive of whatever happens. And there is no, I mean, I'm paraphrasing Joseph Goldstein. There is no hierarchy of experience. From the perspective of Vipassana, all experience is just, to quote his teacher, Munindra, all experience is just empty phenomena rolling on.
Right.
So if you're seeking, I don't know if do you hear that there's a subtle seeking and grasping after certain kinds of experiences that you correlate with good meditation.
That is the paradox of meditation, and I'm not sure there's a way around it. You are trying to do something, but if you look at Joseph's book, his first book, I think, The Experience of Insight, it's pretty strict. It's like focus on one point where the breath is coming in. Some people vary that, and for a while to focus on one point, and then another point that the breath is hitting in the nose. Don't do that. Don't do that. Read the book. Okay.
No, I have. I mean, and I think, that in fairness to Joseph, that was written early in his early career. And he was just back from intensive work with this guy, Upandita, among other teachers. So there, we're talking about skillful means and using different tools in service of the deeper intention or even heart mission. Mm-hmm. And, the thing that I think I see common to many of these traditions is that it's not about what's happening. It's about the recognition or the access to the awareness that notices what's going on. Mm-hmm. So I think, to use a metaphor, I feel like when you go on retreat, and I know this experience too, your mind gets very clear. You feel the clarity of the mind relative to things coming and going within it. Mm-hmm. So you have a sense of your mind being like as the Tibetans describe as the wide open blue sky. Now, I feel like when you get back to daily life, you're noticing a lot more clouds, a lot more weather pattern in the mind, and wanting or hankering for the more open dimension of the cloudless mind. But that's a form of subtle attachment.
Yeah, I do. I had heard, I don't think I've read it, but I had heard that there's a sutra in which the Buddha refers to meditation as the one healthy attachment or something. Is that, have you heard this?
I think, I don't know that particular sutta, but I think if I'm correct, the word that differentiates between the grasping after sense pleasure and the grasping after, say, the Dharma,
right,
is that there's tanha, which is grasping after some kind of sense pleasure or just aversion to something. But then there's also chandra. There's this wholesome desire with liberation, compassion, etc.
Yeah.
I haven't looked that up too recently, so don't hold me too tightly to it.
I also, by the way, have not recently revisited the sunk cost fallacy, and I suddenly fear that I may have misdescribed it. So I want to throw that out there too. So we've been talking
probably too long.
We're not quite Joe Rogan length, but it's been an hour and a half. So maybe we should show some mercy for people who have
stuck with us.
Who have stuck with us. And but this has been helpful. And I think and I think the thing we agree on is if you're meditating and you succeed in paying attention to anything, that's a good thing. And also, I think we agreed you shouldn't waste time chastising yourself for your mind having wandered. And I do mean what I said. This thing when I said better than average mind wandering, I find that if I close my eyes for a sustained period of time and just let my mind wander, sometimes it wanders onto some good idea or some way of handling something that I need to handle or something. I think it's more likely to do that than it is if I'm walking down the street and my mind is wandering. Mm-hmm. Because at least you don't get distracted from the wandering when your eyes are closed. Anyway, I'm not sure how consonant that is or isn't with other things I just said, but
In consideration of your listeners' time, I'll hold back on.
You'll hold back on. You won't
going further with that.
Anything else though you quickly want to say? I want to.
Well, before we started recording, I had brought up the work of Philip Tetlock.
Oh, right.
And Peter Skoblich.
Yep. So Peter I recently saw something on Twitter. I mean, Philip Tetlock is kind of, I guess, famous for looking at what is and isn't conducive to successful prediction. And then Peter Skoblich, whom you and I, it turns out, both know from very different realms.
Yes.
Had collaborated with him on something. I didn't have time to look it up. It just caught my eye on Twitter.
I've caught a few things that they've collaborated on. I don't know the extent of their collaboration, but it seems, as I was trying to say, it seems to sit within a broad sense of the Dharma of Bob in terms of looking at cognitive biases, how they affect decision making, and then how those the predictions that come from those biases lead to inaccurate predictions about real world events. Yeah.
Now that's I need to look into his stuff and their stuff more.
Yeah. So they would be maybe get them both together or individually on the show.
Yeah. Yeah. I've got to get more systematic in using the right show to examine some of these things. Bring on people who know more about them than I do. Hard as that may be for me to imagine, could be the case.
Lastly, how is the book coming?
Book? What book? I mean, the book, the newsletter. I assume you're referring to my my vow in my newsletter to try to write a book actually called, or at least deserving of the title, The Apocalypse Aversion Project, which is kind of a recurring theme in the especially, I guess, maybe the paywalled version of the newsletter for paid subscribers. I gotta say, not a lot of progress. I do have reason to believe that I am now going to be able to get more serious about building something, a kind of a resource site that deserves the term Apocalypse Aversion Project, and kind of is a place people can go to more easily figure out what I mean by the term, what the dimensions are, how, what I think could bring on something almost worthy of the name the apocalypse if we don't solve these global problems, what the psychological roots of our failure to solve the problems are, and so on. So I'm optimistic about starting to be able to present a more coherent package within a couple of months, I'd say. It'll start showing up online and be accessible via the newsletter. The Nonzero newsletter, I should remember to say, in self-promotion mode. But the book, I've just, between the newsletter and the podcast, I mean, I've written things in the newsletter that could in some sense be parts of a book. It's just that they're not, none of them amount to clean chapters where you just slap them together. But, my agent very recently said he wants to talk to me, so who knows? Maybe he'll light a fire.
It seems like the right time.
Yeah, it does.
A lot of things swirling around right now that really seem that they would benefit from the wise and sagacious view that you.
Well, nice of you to say that. Maybe we should talk offline about whether there's an easy way to turn all this into a book. Right now, just it's all this that's taking all my time, meaning the newsletter and the podcasts and stuff. But I really do appreciate your interest in this and your willingness to guide me through this and put up with my resistance to some of your meditation guidance. Although I don't think there's that much of a gap in the end.
I don't think there's much gap. It's more language around
more rhetorical.
how to get there. more rhetorical, right?
More, me being the wanting to be a recalcitrant student whenever possible. And I want to again, I want to kind of close, again, just, repeating our appreciation of everything Michael Brooks did. And it's still out there. And one of the things he did is without trying, but, he led to this series of conversations, between us, which I like
Not
to
only
think.
that, he predicted it. He predicted it, Bob.
Yeah, you told me this.
He gazed into his crystal ball years before. And not just predicted our conversations, but predicted your conversations with him.
Yeah.
But that came out. I mean, at the memorial, more than one person got up and announced how when they first met Michael Brooks, he, within the first few minutes, mentioned his aspiration to be president or a senator. I mean, this is late teenager who would say these kinds of things. I mean, he just had tremendous aspiration.
Yeah. Well, and he was very determined. And he achieved a whole lot. So Google him.
Yes. He's all over YouTube.
All over YouTube.
Yeah.
And he wrote a book about the intellectual dark web and discussed that with me on my show. It's all there. I
need to listen to that. I haven't gotten a copy of that book.
And co-authored the book with you. Is it the Buddha's playbook or the Buddhist?
It's the Buddhist playbook. It's only available as a PDF, ebook on my site right now. But I have plans to get it back into a printed circulation.
So people go to what URL to get the PDF?
joshsummers.net.
All right.
And it's a PDF ebook with some guided meditations that I did if people are interested.
Okay. I'm sure there are
many. $10. $10 for it all.
Can't beat that. And I'm sure there's a lot of stuff at your site. And thanks again, Josh. So let's do this down the road. Let's continue until I am enlightened.
Or vice versa.
Oh, I thought you already were. If you're not enlightened, I'm afraid I have no interest in getting further guidance from you.
By your definition, I will never be enlightened.
I think that's the right definition, but we can argue about that later.
Next time.
Okay. Thanks, Josh.
Thanks, Bob.
See you next time.